All right, welcome to another deep dive. Buckle up, because this time we are talking about constructivism in education.
You know,
We got a really interesting stack of sources for this one.
looks like someone out there really doesn't like
Oh
constructivism.
yeah, this one critique we have is spicy. Like
Yeah.
they're comparing it to
To what?
schizophrenia.
Wow. Okay, so I think to really understand this one, we got to back up. What is constructivism, really? Why does it get people this riled up?
Right, right. So it's this idea that students, they aren't just like empty buckets waiting to be filled with knowledge, right?
Right.
They're actively building their own knowledge
Yeah.
through their experiences and stuff.
So, like, it's more about the journey than the destination.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one thing this critique is really hung up on. They say this whole constructing knowledge thing is way too vague.
How do you even measure that?
Yeah, exactly. And like some constructivists say that truth is relative,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
except when it comes to their own ideas, apparently.
Oh, the irony.
Right. And the critique totally calls them out on that. It's like, okay, if all truth is relative, then why should we believe you?
That's a pretty good point. I mean, it seems like even just defining constructivism is tricky.
Totally. And then there's a whole debate about traditional teaching,
Like a lecture-style classroom.
yeah, drills, memorization, all that stuff. This critique claims that constructivists just, like, dismiss all of that. Which, to be fair,
There are times when those methods are useful.
right, like sometimes you just got to memorize your multiplication tables.
Yeah, you're not going to construct those from scratch.
Exactly. And the critique is worried that by focusing so much on the process of learning, constructivists might be neglecting the actual content, the
Ooh,
knowledge itself.
the building blocks.
Yeah, exactly. So it's
Yeah.
like, how do you balance that? How do you encourage exploration, but also make sure kids are learning, essential stuff?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it gets even more complicated when you bring in those big names in educational psychology.
You're talking about Piaget and Vygotsky.
Yeah, those guys, constructivists love to name drop them. But this critique argues that they're kind of cherry-picking what they like from those theories.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Like, Piaget. He was mostly focused on kids interacting with physical stuff, not the social world. And Vygotsky, well, he actually wrote a lot about, get this, conditioned reflexes.
Wait, isn't that a behaviorist concept?
Exactly. And behaviorism is like the opposite of constructivism. So there's definitely some selective reading going on there.
So things are getting even murkier down here.
Oh, yeah. And we haven't even gotten to the really juicy part yet. This critique claims that constructivism can actually
It can what? Don't leave me hanging.
stifle individual thought.
Wait, what? I thought constructivism was all about empowering students.
Well, hold on, because it gets kind of paradoxical. You see, there's this thing called social constructivism.
Social constructivism.
Yeah, where knowledge is like negotiated by the group, you know? So imagine a classroom where everyone's always debating and discussing.
Sounds kind of chaotic, but okay.
Right, and that's where the trouble comes in. Because whose voices actually get heard in those discussions? This critique actually quotes a constructivist text that says students are, and I'm quoting here, constrained by an obligation to develop interpretations that fit those of other members of the classroom community.
So peer pressure to conform.
Basically.
Yeah.
And the critique is worried that this emphasis on consensus might end up silencing those who disagree.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very empowering.
Right. So it raises this really interesting question. If all knowledge is constructed, then who decides which constructions are the right ones?
And that's a question we are going to tackle right after the break.
Yeah.
Stay with us.
Okay, so where were we?
Oh, yeah. We were just talking about how social constructivism can get, well, a little too social. Like, what happens to the kids who don't agree with the group?
Right, right. It's a good question. And this critique really makes you think about how power dynamics play out in a constructivist classroom.
Especially if the teacher is more of a facilitator than the traditional authority figure.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of people see that shift in power as a good thing, right? It's about giving students more agency, more ownership over their learning.
Which makes sense, in theory.
But this critique argues that it's not always that simple. Like, what about those kids who need more structure, more guidance?
Yeah, like, not everyone learns best by just, diving into a project and figuring things out on their own.
Some people need a little more scaffolding, some clear explanations, some direct instruction even. And that's something this critique says constructivists sometimes overlook.
They're so focused on, the process that they forget about the actual knowledge and skills kids need to develop.
You can't build a house without a blueprint.
Okay, that's a good analogy.
Right. You need a solid foundation before you can start getting all creative with the architecture. And this critique is worried that some constructivist classrooms might be neglecting that foundation.
Building on sand.
Exactly. And, another thing this critique brings up is the whole issue of assessment. Like, how do you even know if constructivist teaching is working?
Yeah, that's a big one. How do you measure something as fuzzy as constructing knowledge?
Especially when some constructivists are, like, totally against traditional tests and grades.
They say it like depersonalizes students or something.
Yeah, and I get that. Nobody likes standardized testing. But this critique is like, come on, you need some way to track progress, right?
Otherwise, how do you know if kids are actually learning?
And how do you identify those who might be falling behind?
It's not just about grades. It's about making sure everyone has the support they need to succeed.
Right. Assessment should be a tool for helping students learn, not just for judging them.
Yeah.
And this critique is basically saying that constructivists need to get real about that.
So it sounds like even though constructivism has a lot of good ideas,
Definitely.
there are some practical challenges that need to be addressed.
I think that's a fair assessment. And, the interesting thing is that a lot of these challenges stem from this fundamental tension within constructivism itself.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, on the one hand, you have this emphasis on individual exploration, right? Students constructing their own knowledge. But on the other hand, you have this focus on the social aspect of learning, the idea that knowledge is negotiated within a group.
So it's like individualism versus collectivism.
Kind of, yeah. And this critique is pointing out that those two things can sometimes be at odds with each other.
So how do you strike that balance? How do you create a classroom that values both individual expression and collective understanding?
Well, that's a question for the ages, isn't it?
It is. And thankfully, we have some more sources that try to answer that question, at least partially. And guess what? They actually offer some pretty cool solutions.
Sounds promising.
It is. And we're going to dive into those right after...
It's a very short break.
Nope. No breaks. We are diving right in. All right, so we've seen some pretty harsh criticisms of constructivism. But, like every story has two sides.
Yeah, for sure. And luckily, we have some sources here that offer a different, a more balanced perspective.
Like the social cognitive theory thing.
Oh, yeah, that was interesting. It kind of bridges the gap between constructivism and behaviorism, the idea that we learn through observation and stuff.
Right. Like, we're not just little robots responding to stimuli.
Exactly. But we're also not, constructing knowledge in a vacuum.
We're watching other people.
Learning from their example.
Yeah. Think about, how kids learn to talk. They're not just, making up grammar rules.
They're listening to adults, imitating them.
Right. And this theory says that teachers can actually use that to their advantage.
By being good role models.
Yeah. Like showing students how to think critically, how to solve problems. It's like, think aloud. Let the kids see your thought process. I like that. And then this other source, the one about situated learning, that one's cool too.
Oh, yeah. That one's all about context.
Like making learning relevant to kids' lives.
Right. Instead of just abstract concepts in a textbook.
Yeah. So instead of learning about fractions, you'd, I don't know, bake a cake or something.
Exactly. Something hands-on, something they can connect to.
It makes learning more meaningful.
And more engaging too, which is, half the battle.
Totally. And I think all of this stuff, it kind of helps address some of those criticisms we talked about earlier.
Yeah, the worry that constructivism is too focused on process and not enough on outcomes.
Right. If you're teaching kids how to learn and you're making the learning relevant to their lives,
then you're more likely to see those positive outcomes.
Exactly. And, at the end of the day, I think that's what we all want, right?
To help kids become lifelong learners.
Yeah, people who are curious, who can adapt to new situations, who can solve problems.
People who can think for themselves.
And that's, I think, the real legacy of constructivism. It's not just about a specific teaching method.
It's about a mindset.
Yeah, a way of approaching the world. And that's something worth constructing, I think.
I agree. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the good, the bad, and the kind of confusing parts of constructivism.
Yeah, we did a whole deep dive. And hopefully you, dear listeners, surfaced with some new insights and maybe even more questions.
Always more questions. That's what keeps us learning.
That's the truth. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.